Good afternoon, this is Mrs. Ward and this is a lesson on Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet. So the aim of this session is to explore the character of Mercutio and how he is presented by Shakespeare. I suggest that you pause the video at points and make notes on his character and create a collage of information about Mercutio, so key quotations, keywords, but also think about what is his role within the play, why is he there, what is his function. So first of all, we'll start with his name and the analysis of his name. So the name Mercutio comes from the word Mercury, and to have a mercurial character would suggest that you are somewhat erratic, volatile and unstable. So straight away his name, and the name chosen by Shakespeare, gives us a clue about his character. Now it also says that Mercury was the messenger of the gods, the god of trade, merchants and travel, a guide of the dead. He has influenced the name of many. Things. Now, Mercutio's character can also be linked to Mercury in the sense of temperature. Okay, so the idea of having a hot temper and being somewhat unstable and volatile, and we do see that in his character in the play through his behaviour. So a little bit of context information, because whenever you're writing about a literature text, you need to understand the context, what was going on socially, historically, culturally. So in Shakespeare's times, the Elizabethan era, many people believed that the body had four humours, in a similar way to the universe having four elements, so air, fire, water and earth. So the four humours were blood, bile, phlegm and black bile. Now yellow bile was linked to choler or anger, and black bile was linked to melancholy, so sadness. So obviously medical science was not particularly advanced, so people really did believe that the body was controlled by the four humours. So these bodily fluids determined the complexion of a person, not just facially, but in the sense of their physical and mental constitution. So if the four humours were in their proper proportions, a person had perfect health in body and peace of mind. But this seldom happened, and usually one humour was dominant. So have a little look at the four humours. You've got blood. So blood was associated with being ruddy, fair, agreeable, cheerful, courageous, lusty, riotous and impractical. Choler meant you were prone to anger, rashness and pride. Phlegm meant that you were pale in complexion, fat, torpid and dull. And melancholy means lean, swarthy, morose and introspective. So which of those would you say applied to Mercutio? Have a little think about what you know about Mercutio from your studies of the play so far. In my opinion, the first two seem to apply to Mercutio. He's a character that is kind of cheerful and a fun, upbeat character. He's also not afraid of battle, so he's quite courageous and full of life, so kind of that lusty character. Choler as well, prone to anger and rashness. We see that in Mercutio's character. So you could argue that they are his character flaws or his hamartia. Don't forget, in tragedy, your hamartia was the aspect of your character that would bring about your downfall. So Romeo's hamartia is his impulsive and rash nature. Everything he does is on an impulse, and that helps bring about his own demise. If he'd been less impulsive, he would have lived to have seen Juliet wake up. Juliet's hamartia is her complete devotion to Romeo at the cost of all else. So you could argue that that helps to bring about her downfall. And Mercutio is obviously one of the characters who dies in the centre of the play in Act 3. And we could argue that Mercutio's kind of feisty nature is part of what brings about his downfall. He won't back down from the fight. He won't watch his friend be dishonoured by Tybalt, and as a result, he's killed. You could also say that he underestimates the feud completely. He doesn't take it that seriously. He thinks that Tybalt is all talk. He thinks he's a fashionista who just goes strutting around the town and doesn't really take Tybalt's threats all of that seriously. And again, you could argue that's really tragic, because Mercutio is this really fun, upbeat, comic character in his late teens, early 20s, who thinks life's a big blast and a big joy, and he just gets caught in the crossfires of this feud. So his death is a real turning point in the play. So have a little look at the characteristics. So which humour does Mercutio fit into the most? Does he fit into all of the humours? Think about his name and associations. You might want to pause the video here and make a few notes on his characteristics. Now, I've just mentioned to you that Mercutio's death is at the climax of the play. It's Act 3. So if you're not familiar with Freytag's pyramid, I would like you to pause the video and copy this out. Now, when you were in primary school, when you were writing a story, your teacher might have told you to think about creating a beginning and a middle and an end. Freytag, the guy behind this pyramid, he came up with something a little bit more complex. So you have these key moments in the pyramid, and that every good story should follow these key aspects. And now Romeo and Juliet certainly does follow this pattern. So if you have a little look here in the exposition, we are introduced to the families, the Montagues and the Capulets. We learn that they are enemies, and we're set up with this violent background. In Act 2, during the rising action, we see the major characters evolving and major events, which is that Romeo and Juliet meet and fall in love, and obviously plan to marry. Now, we know that this is going to create complications and dangers. Now, at the climax of the play, this is Act 3, we see the death of Mercutio and the death of Tybalt. And it's really at this point that the plays become a tragedy. Almost up until here, it could almost be quite comic. We have this silly feud and the idea that these secret lovers fall in love from opposite families. It has these comic elements, and Mercutio is a really comic character, and there's a lot of humour and innuendo up until this point. This is where things get serious, and this is where we can think about Mercutio's role, because actually he underestimates the feud, and his death is the turning point where we really see actually this feud is serious and it's costing people their lives. And if tragedy is a criticism of society, then we sort of see that start with Mercutio's death, because from there is so much bloodshed, so much turmoil, and all for a feud that they can't really remember the cause of, this ancient grudge. Now, after the deaths of Tybalt and Mercutio, we go into the fall in action. Okay, Romeo is banished, Juliet is completely bereft, she's been forced to marry Paris, and she obviously comes up with the plan to fake her death along with the friar. But unfortunately, fate intervenes, and when we head to the denouement, which is the end of the play, Romeo doesn't receive the letter, and we know that he races back to Verona to be with Juliet. Now, he says, "I defy you, stars." He thinks he's defying fate when he races back to Verona. And the irony is actually he's playing straight into fate's hands. Again, we see his hamartia in action, his impulsive nature. He rushes back to Verona, he takes poison and kills himself. And when Juliet wakes from her sleep, she commits suicide with the dagger. And then we have our Pyrrhic victory. The families bury the feud. They realise they've lost too much on both sides, and we have a glooming peace upon Verona. So Mercutio's death is really important, and therefore his character is really important, because the fact that he is just caught in the crossfire of these families and he dies as a consequence shows us the toxicity of the feud and how ridiculous the violence is. So again, you might want to pause the video and just make some notes on Freytag's pyramid and think about how the play follows that clear structure set out to create the story and the suspense and the tension. Here are some notes on Mercutio, first impressions. So Mercutio is a foil to Romeo. Now, foil is a technical term which means the opposite to Romeo when it comes to his attitude to love. So Romeo is very romantic, he's very heartbroken over his rejection from Rosaline, whereas Mercutio is really light-hearted in his attitude to love. He says to Romeo, "If love be rough with you, you should be rough with love." And he makes lots of sexual innuendos and jokes, and he kind of represents that typical young man of the time that's more lusty than interested in love. So he's quite a nice counterpart to Romeo and shows us that opposite side of attitudes to love. He's a comic character. We see him mocking the nurse quite a lot. in the earlier parts of the play, making rude jokes and innuendos at her expense. And also towards Juliet, he makes some sexual references early on. He says that Romeo is looking for Juliet, and he talks about the popper in pear, and he makes a few sexual crude jokes. He says that Romeo wants to raise a spirit in her circle, which is a reference to having sex. He's Romeo's best friend, and he sees Romeo as gentle. The adjective shows he knows Romeo well, because we obviously know that Romeo is gentle, he's sensitive, he's your classic lover, not a fighter. And it's sad in a way that Romeo doesn't kind of sort of feel the need to be that macho male, and yet when his best friend is killed by Tybalt, he feels to blame. He feels like his love has made him effeminate. He questions his own masculinity, and as a consequence, he becomes the aggressive male, and he gets revenge and kills Tybalt. And it's all part of this sad society that these men feel like they need to fight to prove themselves. So again, if tragedy is a criticism of society, what is Shakespeare criticising here about violence and about the fact that people feel obliged to take on certain roles, and in this case, aggressive roles? His name is symbolic. Mercutio's name is symbolic. It means he's volatile, and he certainly is a volatile character in the play. He doesn't belong to either the Montagues or the Capulets. He's actually a kinsman to the prince, Prince Aeschylus. Now, Aeschylus is symbolic. The name Aeschylus literally links to the word scales, and the scales link to ideas about justice and law and order. So again, when Mercutio is killed, it's really a huge loss to Verona, because the prince is directly affected, and it's that realization that this feud is completely out of hand now. It's affecting more than just the Montagues and the Capulets. It's out of control. So again, Shakespeare is showing us that violence in society is a terrible thing, and it has no place. Now, up here you have one of your technical terms that I talked to you about in your last lesson, the peripeteia. This is a turning point or a sudden reversal of fortunes. So up until Act 3, Romeo's really happy. He's just got married to Juliet. He's literally loving life. And then all of a sudden, his best friend is killed, and he feels responsible for that. So it's a sudden reversal of fortune. So again, Mercutio is a really important character because his death is symbolic of that turn in events, and this is what the catalyst that brings about the tragedy, because as soon as Mercutio is dead, Romeo feels guilty and feels like he hasn't honoured his friend. He feels the need to take on that aggressive male role, and as a result, he's banished, and obviously all of the consequences that follow from that point. So I would like you to make notes here and just jot down these words to describe Mercutio. And as you're studying Mercutio and looking through the text, try and find quotations to support each one. All of these you're probably familiar with. And as you look through, obviously Mercutio only features in the first 3 acts, so you don't have a huge amount to trawl through to find your quotations. And obviously the notes from the previous slide as well. Jot them down to build up your knowledge of this character, Mercutio. So, how does Shakespeare present the relationship between Romeo and Mercutio? Look at the mirroring of words and images. Mercutio is a foil to Romeo. How do their views on love differ? What is Mercutio's attitude to dreams? How does it differ to Romeo's? Romeo has 2 dreams which foreshadow the end of the play, so what is the significance? Okay, think about genre. It's like he predicts his own death, his own demise, and that's tragic. He can't change it. We know it's going to happen, so we're kind of all victims of fate. We can't escape our fate, and Shakespeare hammers that message home. So I'm just going to show you a clip now, if I can get this to work, of Mercutio in the Baz Luhrmann version of the film, delivering his famous Queen Mab speech. It's a famous speech about dreams, and I'm just going to see if I can get that open. So I just showed you a little bit of the scene there, just to show you the closeness between Romeo and Mercutio. And I asked you to think about the mirroring of words. So, Romeo says, love is too rough, too rude, it pricks like a thorn. And Mercutio kind of bounces back and says, well, if love be rough with you, be rough with love. So he's like the light-hearted comic side, and Romeo seems to need that sort of friend. And also Romeo says, he can't dance. He uses that phrase, I have a soul of lead, and the play on the words of soul. And Mercutio tells him to fly above, like you're a lover, you have Cupid's wings, fly above and be happy. So Mercutio is this really positive character and a positive influence. So again, his death is shocking, and he's caught in the crossfire between these two families. So we have a scene here, which I will leave on the screen for you, or you can pause it, so that you can take some notes and look at the relationship between Romeo and Juliet. So Mercutio refers to Romeo here, look, near gentle Romeo, we must have you dance. So Mercutio wants to bring out the fun side of Romeo. And Romeo replies with, you have dancing shoes with nimble soles, but I have a soul of lead. Now you've got the play on words here. He says you have nimble soles, referring to the soles of his shoe, but he says I have a soul of lead, meaning his spirit is heavy because he's broken-hearted, because Rosaline rejected him. He's suffering from unrequited love. Now Mercutio says to Romeo, you are a lover, borrow Cupid's wings and soar with them above a common bound. So again, Mercutio knows Romeo well. He knows that Romeo is a romantic. Romeo replies with, I am too sore and pierced with his shaft to soar with his light feathers, and so bound. I cannot bound a pitch above the winds, or love's heavy burden do I sink. So we're seeing love being presented as a complex thing. Romeo's attitude to love is that it's something that's causing him to drown. It's a burden, it's a weight upon him. Now Mercutio, again, we see this mirroring of language. And to sink in it should your burden love, too great oppression for a tender thing. So he's saying, love's supposed to be tender, it's supposed to be nice. And Romeo comes back with the question, is love a tender thing? It is too rough, too rude, too boisterous, and it pricks like a thorn. So Romeo is presenting love as something that causes pain and suffering. Mercutio, again, bounces back because Mercutio is a foil to Romeo. He's the opposite, the counter side. If love be rough with you, be rough with love, prick love for pricking, and you beat love down. So there's a little bit of sexual innuendo in there as well. But this scene basically shows us the closeness between Mercutio and Romeo, and highlights why Mercutio's death is such a loss for Romeo. Some other scenes to look at for you to gather your quotations from. So this is Act 3. Now, Benvolio, who we know, his name means benevolent, means the peacekeeper, somebody who doesn't like to fight. He's saying to Mercutio, we should leave, we need to go. These hot days is the mad blood stirring. So we see a bit of pathetic fallacy in action here. The hot weather reflects the hot tempers of these characters. But Mercutio, he doesn't want to leave. Okay, he says, thou art like one of these fellows that when he enters the confines of a tavern, claps me his sword upon thy table and says, God send me no need of these, and by the operation of the second cup, draws it on the drawer, and indeed there is no need. He's mocking Benvolio there. He says, you're the type of guy that goes into a bar, puts your sword on the table and says, I don't need a sword. And by the time you've had your second drink, you're drawing your sword, even though you don't need it. So he's saying, you're not perfect. You're just as likely to fight as the rest of us. So we're seeing Mercutio being quite feisty, quite quick-witted in this scene. So again, you might want to pause the video and make some notes on Mercutio. You had the slide previously with all of those keywords on, like fiery, swordsman, all of that list of words to describe Mercutio. You might want to take some quotations from this to add to that. So when Tybalt finally turns up, this is right before Mercutio dies, and he's insulted by Tybalt, but he's looking for an argument. So Tybalt turns up and says that he's looking for a word, and Mercutio says a word and a blow. So he's saying we're going to fight. Now when Tybalt refers to, he says, thou consort with Romeo, he takes an insult to the word consort. He says, what dost thou make us minstrels? Art thou make minstrels of us? Look to hear nothing but discords. Here's my fiddlestick, here's that shall make you dance, zounds, consort. Now this is really aggressive. He takes an insult at the word consort. He thinks that Tybalt is referring to them as like street performers, low class. So he thinks it's like a derogatory phrase. But we could argue Mercutio is just looking for that fight. He draws his sword. He makes the joke, I'll make you dance with the sword. But it's very light-hearted. Again, I think Mercutio just thinks they're going to have a little bit of a fight and it'll all be fun. Now, Benvolio, we see still trying to keep the peace. You know, we're here in a public haunt. Let's withdraw somewhere private. Let's depart. Mercutio refuses. I will not budge for no man's pleasure. So we see his stubborn nature there, which was mentioned on a previous slide. And again, perhaps we're seeing his hamartia here. He underestimates the severity of this feud. He doesn't think it's going to end how it ends. Tybalt sees Romeo arrive in and says, peace be with you, sir. Here comes my man. And Romeo refuses to fight. And this is what really riles Mercutio. We see his macho nature appearing, and we see this bravado, but also this sense of honour. He feels like Tybalt is dishonouring Romeo, and Romeo's not defending himself, and that's why Mercutio decides to defend his friend's honour. So it all links back to these male expectations and ideas about honour. And lastly, this is the scene in which Mercutio dies. So he's injured under Romeo's arm. They don't think the wound can be that serious. He says, I am here, a plague on both your houses. I am sped. Is he gone and hath nothing? And Benvolio says, what are you hurt? And Mercutio still, we see this dark humour. Aye, a scratch, but it's enough. Where's my page? Go, villain, fetch a surgeon. So Mercutio knows he's dying, but he sort of downplays it. Romeo says, courage, man, the hurt cannot be much. And then we see the true severity of the situation. Mercutio dies angry. So have a look at his speech. We've still got the humour. We've still got the play on words. He says, my injury, sir, it is not so deep as a well, nor so wide as a church door, but it's enough. It will serve. Ask for me tomorrow, and you shall find me a grave man. I am peppered, I warrant for this world, a plague on both your houses. Zounds, a dog, a rat, a mouse, a cat, to scratch a man to death, a braggart, a rogue, a villain that fights by the book of arithmetic. Why the devil came you between us? I was hurt under your arm. So, you know, his final words are making Romeo feel terrible because he feels like he's been killed for something that was not even his sort of argument. He's been killed by someone he doesn't even respect as a fighter. You know, he's been killed by someone who he describes to fight by the book of arithmetic. So he thinks that Tybalt just got a lucky shot. And you know, there's the pun, ask me tomorrow and you'll find me a grave man. So his dying speech is angry. He wishes a curse on both the families. And this is that peripeteia that we were talking about earlier. It's the turning point and it's the catalyst for the tragedy to follow. So what is Mercutio's role? What is his function in this play? Well, he's Romeo's best friend. He's a light-hearted comic character that gives us lots of humour. He makes a lot of sexual innuendos. It would have entertained the audiences. He's a neutral character in the sense that he doesn't belong to the Montagues or the Capulets, and yet he is the first death, which shows us how terrible the feud is, how toxic this violence is in society, and Shakespeare is criticising that. And his death brings about the tragedy that follows because Romeo feels compelled to defend his friend, and he feels like he's let his friend down. He says that my love have made me effeminate. He feels like he's not a proper man because he let his friend die. So again, we see that Romeo is crumbling under those pressures to be a man in society, and it leads to more bloodshed. So again, we could argue that Shakespeare is making some commentary on the roles of genders within society. There's a model response here. I will let you pause this to read it on your own. There's a slide here for you to take a look at. It explores the relationship between Romeo and Mercutio. And then there's a similar one about Mercutio's attitude to dreams. So that concludes the lesson on Mercutio. Please do make notes, go back through the slides. I'm just clicking back through them now. So here's your list of key terms for Mercutio. I've obviously mentioned some new terms today as well, so things like peripeteia, foil. So you might want to think about those terms and phrases. And I would ask you to take some time now to build up a portfolio of notes and information, a character study, a collage, a timeline, whatever you want to do to make your notes on Mercutio. Thanks for listening. Good afternoon.